Hey friends, it's Brett back with another episode of Seeking Our Spirit. Got to sit down with a good friend of mine, Peg Hess, today and had a great chat exploring her journey and her stories. So I hope that you enjoy. As always, if you want to come and be on the show, contact me at seekingOurSpirit@gmail.com. That's the best way to support the show, or send me names of folks you think would be good on the show. Also, if you don't want to be interviewed but have a story, a spiritual story, anything of that sort, you can contact me either at that email, or you can call and leave a message and I'll share that story. Call me at 615-933-9737. And as always, keep hitting the like buttons, the share buttons, share the podcast and the episodes around to your friends. And if you're able to, hit the support button and donate a couple bucks a month. That always helps us keep things going. So hope you enjoy, as always, and we'll keep exploring. Peace. Cool. So we are live and going.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Peg Hess. As we were just sort of chatting a second ago, one, good to have you, and thanks for your vulnerability and your willingness to come and talk to me about this kind of, this personal exploration into, like I just said a second ago, what we mean when we say spirit or spirituality, and sort of looking at that through the lens of people's lives. So I appreciate you. I was thinking on the way over here too, and I probably repeat this all the time and people probably get sick of it, but I just love, I've known you now for 15 years, 16 years. We've had a lot of interactions. We've been in a rhythm of life together under certain circumstances, like at Ascension and here. And it's like, and yet we've never just sat and talked for, a good hour about our lives. So that's always so special to me. So, yeah. So why don't you just say briefly for folks, like, who you are, where you're from, what you've done in life, just biography, and then we'll jump in.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. A lot of stuff.
Well, I'm Peg. My parents named me Mary Margaret. They never call me either word. And I certainly, we're thinking about this conversation. It really quickly brings to mind that part of who I am is a minister's daughter.
A minister's daughter.
Minister's daughter. That's been a very powerful identity still, but and a complicated one.
Yeah,
very complicated one. I'm a social worker. I'll just go chronologically. That's the easiest way. After I finished undergraduate school, I'd learned about social work. I'd planned to be a high school teacher, and I didn't even know there was, a profession that's intention was to be helpful.
Yeah. That is the nice thing about social work, right?
To individuals, families, groups, communities, and actually when I was at Columbia, we had students who were all over the world, and many of whom were at the UN. I never had thought of that span of what kind of things social workers do. And I would say that training is a part, I learned that training is a part of my spirituality, because social workers' values are very strongly respectful of people's decisions, their conditions, their situations. It's where you start where the client is. And so there's this huge emphasis on that, being self-aware. And part of there was a period when Howard and I were really seekers, each of us in our own way, and trying to find a church that we were both comfortable in. And I was aware during that process how much my social work training influenced the way I thought about my spiritual.
Yeah.
That it was, if I went to a place that was in the 60s. 60s, 70s. And if I found that the minister and people seemed disrespectful or excluded anybody for anything,
you just
I didn't feel at home.
Yeah,
I just couldn't feel at home. And so, any rate, so my work in social work was probably for about 50 years.
Okay.
And so it included being a therapist, it included being a teacher, included a lot of child advocacy work. I did about 10 years when I retired from teaching of being an expert for class action suits on foster care abuse and problems in foster care.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, I'm sorry, I'm thinking. Somewhere in there, I guess when we lived in Aiken, I felt called, and we can come back to that. Yeah. I felt called to get trained to be a spiritual director.
Yeah.
So that happened about 25 years ago now.
Wow. Yeah, I'll definitely want to dig into that a little bit.
And it was another really important
milestone.
Became a very important part of my identity.
Yeah.
As I learned and as I've practiced it.
Yeah. It's something that feeds me a lot too. It's a beautiful practice that I wish more and more people were aware of or knew about. You know.
I've become aware that it is one of the experiences that I can count on to deepen my faith. When I observe and hear about what people who've made that intention to be closer to God and live a life that reflects their sense of what life should be, that the changes I've seen in people over the years that I've met with them are just phenomenal. And part of what's really clear is I know it's not me.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I really know it's the Spirit working in them.
Something happens.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring you back to childhood before we jump into all that good stuff.
All right.
But before that, but you're from Tennessee.
I was born in Morristown.
Morristown. Okay. Yeah.
And then my dad was a Methodist minister. First, he went to seminary.
You all moved around.
So we went to Durham. He went to seminary at Duke University. And he loved that. My mom and I used to go when we would go to pick him up, sit in the huge chapel there and listen to somebody practice the organ. That was always great.
Nice.
And then his first church was in, it's up north of here. There's one of those little La Follette.
Yeah.
And so we were in Chattanooga twice. We were in Knoxville twice. He served in Maryville and a lot of other places after I left home.
So big, as you mentioned, big part of your life is being as we say, a PK, right? Pastor's kid or priest kid. And then just naming biography stuff for folks. So we named social work, but obviously wife, mother, grandmother as well. And of course our stories intersected as I was coming out of seminary to Knoxville, and you guys had. Yeah. And I know there's way more there, right?
And actually, I really felt for a number of years there, after you came to Ascension, it's very hard to have your husband be your priest. It's just not really possible.
Yeah.
That I kind of, and we talked about it a couple of times, that you were my priest. That if I needed a priest, you would be my priest.
Yeah.
And so that's something I always need to know who my priest is.
I know. I feel that way for Carla now, and we don't have multiple clergy,
Right.
So thank you. That means a lot to me. So part of what I like to do in these episodes is walk people through, actually I sort of steal this term from Howard, like spiritual timeline, right? Like so I want to just, in terms of Peg's awareness of relationship with God or Holy Spirit, whatever spirituality means to you, where does that first memory kind of come in? I mean, is it because you were a PK and so you're going to be in the church, a lot, but for you, where does like spirituality first kind of become a thing, or like, relationship with God? Maybe you always felt that way. Maybe there was a moment. I don't know.
I guess that must be true, because it's hard to think of a first moment.
No.
I think that when I was, before my dad was the minister of a church I was in, while he was in seminary, I would have to say that I think some of my first moments were in the chapel at Duke.
Yeah.
Going in there, I was probably 2, 3 with my mom, and we went in there probably 2 or 3 times a week, really. Yeah. We would just go and wait there. It was part of the plan.
Yeah.
Not like you'd rush to pick him up, but you go in the chapel, you'd listen, then you'd get Dad. Yeah. And the sense of awe.
Yeah.
And I would call it that now. I'm sure I didn't call it that then, but the Spirit's presence is palpable in that place.
So the beauty and the sacredness and the holiness of the place, and obviously the music.
And the music. The music.
Which clicks with me right away in your story. I hear in that sort of your photography, your eye for and love of the beauty around us. That sort of clicks. Okay, cool. That makes sense.
And later, I went to Duke and sang in the Duke choir. Oh. So, and actually studied organ for like a year and took my lessons and practiced on the Duke organ.
Oh, wow.
But I never played the organ. It was just, I don't know, it was too big.
Yeah.
Too big. Not in the sense of size, but the whole production
thing. It's so much. It's amazing how they can do that. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that's a great little sort of memory moment, milestone there, I guess, or touchstone. When you think of childhood, adolescence, whatever, where are those sort of memorable spiritual moments for you? Or did you experience highs and lows spiritually? What was growing up in that process like? And it probably gets really, I would imagine it gets really murky, right? Because of the PK thing, your relationship with church, and therefore conflated with spirituality. It's like, well, there's probably a resistance, I would assume, as well.
There was a huge ambivalence. And the expectations, while I was thinking about talking with you, one of the memories that came to me, and I think I was in probably 6th or 7th grade. We had just moved to Chattanooga, and we were the church we were going to was White Oak Methodist Church. And I can remember this clear as a bell, stepping out of the car. It was spring. You could see daffodils, but it was cold. And saying to myself, okay, you're on stage now.
Oh, wow.
And that's at some point between when I was, in quotes, little, as I grew up, the expectations of how you behaved. Yeah. I mean, my sister and I particularly were always get into these laughing things together, and we'd have to climb down under the pews or something. My mother would just be beside herself, you know. Especially in prayer meeting. I mean, we went to church so much, actually.
It's just your house, you know? It's no different. Yeah.
And so performing in the church was also part of it, singing.
Yeah.
My dad in prayer meeting on one Wednesday night, the person who played the piano wasn't there, and he just said, well, Peggy will do it. Yeah. And I'm like, what the? I had no idea that was going to happen. And I did. That's kind of the way it was. If somebody in the church said I would do it, then I would try.
I feel, I've never done anything that big, but I've definitely thrown Haven into, acolyte roles or whatever last second, that's, man, it just comes with it.
Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot with this kind of question. This is sort of like a spiritual direction sort of question.
Yeah.
But what came to me when you were talking about that, about performing in church, do you think that does that spill over to your relationship with God, or did it? Like that sense of needing to perform, or?
That's a really good question. I think during that period when I was younger, I don't remember that it did.
Yeah.
What it did was make me very hypervigilant. I was always really on my toes with the people in the church.
Yeah.
And I resented that they knew things about me that I didn't tell them.
Yeah.
People would come and say, here, I hear you did really well in school, or I hear this, or I hear that. And it was the same kind of how would you know that, And I think what I learned as I got older, and now it's really clear to me, and the word for it is disillusionment.
Uh-huh.
When you know the church and its people, including the minister, so well.
Yeah.
There's a kind of disappointment that really is disillusionment.
Yeah.
And that would mess with my relationship with God, because I would feel like, why don't you do something about this?
Yeah.
Of all places, these kind of things should not be able to happen in a church.
Well, right, because I think at some level, and it's probably not an age thing, I think I see people do this all the time, but people conflate church with God, right? And that's totally not, accurate, but we do that. Man, you make me think. I love this conversation because it's something, and really, I should have been talking to you about this long ago, and I probably always intended to, but just because out of sensitivity for my own children, just understanding how one feels growing up. I think culture and society is different, and I don't think that like my spouse or my children probably feel as much of that pressure as folks did. But it's still there, Yeah. And it's you remind me of that sort of disillusionment. I see this happen sometimes with like people when they get on vestry for the first time. For people who aren't Episcopalian, that's like it's kind of the board of directors in a way, like the leadership group. And right, for some people, not everybody, but some people, it's like, right, you see how the sausage is made, and you see, like, in some ways, a church is trying to run a business in a way, a nonprofit, and it's hard for them. They leave disillusioned. And I've seen some people leave that experience and never be the same. And so I think it's very similar, but a PK grows up with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was confounded by who my dad was.
Uh-huh.
He was a bully. And
just in general, you mean, or in family? Or?
At home.
Yeah.
I learned during the period we knew that he was dying, which was actually very powerful for me to learn some new things positive, powerful things about him and what his life had meant for other people. And I was open to hear it, I think, then more than I was as a kid, really. But there was a flood in East Tennessee, Harriman. He grew up in Harriman.
Okay.
Harriman flooded. And his dad left as the water was coming up. They had a 2-story house to find somebody to help him save his family. And my dad and his mom and younger brother, he was 6 at the time, were rescued off of the roof of his home. And they figured out that what had held the house there was a huge maple that had stood in the way of the house.
Oh, wow.
Just washing away. And it eventually did.
Wow.
Eventually he took us to show us where the house had been. And I think, knowing what I know now, I have a different sense of how totally traumatic that would have been for my dad.
Yeah.
His dad was a very rough dad in terms of discipline. And he and his brother used to tell us stories about it, and they would laugh. But the older I got, the more I knew these were not funny stories.
Yeah, it's not funny, yeah.
And so what I would see is he would be, in terms of being at church, he was kind and warm and friendly and interested in everybody. In terms of being home, he was often really somber.
Yeah.
Would be very somber. I think he was more of an extrovert, really, and that was part of it. It took so much energy for him to be a minister. When he was home, he just kind of retreated, like introverts do.
Oh, you introvert then?
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And but he also could just really be mean.
Yeah.
And I heard stories as I got older of times that it happened in the church over some issue with somebody he just had it with. So I knew it could happen there.
Yeah.
But I really grew up with this sense of maybe he was acting at church.
Yeah.
Maybe he was pretending.
It reinforces.
And I grew up with the real person.
Yeah.
Who could be funny and loving. It's not like he was one thing.
Sure.
He was very complicated. And like in photography, I feel like my sense of loving to look came from him. He was always saying he loved creation. He was always saying, look at this.
Witnessing that all the time.
Yeah. So I think that all of those things together made the church very complicated.
Yeah.
And made my faith very complicated.
Yeah, and that's so.
Because he was what I learned about the time I was a teenager. It was like I conceptualized the problem as, because he was my preacher, he was my God.
Yeah. Wow.
And it really took. It's taken a lot of work, much of which was while I was in my 30s, to separate that out.
Yeah, to separate God from church, really, which sounds odd to say, but especially in this situation is important, and to separate your dad from God, or God from your dad. Yeah. Man, you're just to tag on to this. I mean, one, I hear in that, again, that reinforces, if you're seeing your dad and witnessing him and feeling like it's a performance, reinforces your need to perform, right? And then the other part that I just so personally feel there is, I often, this is somewhat confessional and vulnerable, but I'm an introvert. It takes I love it, but it takes a lot. When I leave church every day, not just on Sunday, every day, I'm done. And I often worry. I don't feel distant at all from my family. We have close relationships. They're good relationships, I think. But I know my energy, and I know when I come home, a lot of times I just don't have anything more, or to listen, right? It's like I'm not which is so unfair. Because you listen intently all day, and yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow. And I think that's a very common thing in clergy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think probably even people who are extroverts, it's very demanding.
Yeah.
It's totally reactive, I think. When a minister or people in other roles are in the church, their job is to react to what people bring to them.
Yeah.
And you never really know in any given day what that's going to be. And it can be, it can be it could be something really big and take a huge amount of energy.
Yeah.
And cause a lot of emotion in you, which I've also really learned for me anyway. When I have a lot of emotion, it wears me out.
Yeah.
Just like, physical exertion. So.
Okay, so anything else when you think of young adulthood or adolescence, any sort of spiritual kind of touchstones you would point to or significant times in your life in terms of spiritual growth? No can be the answer.
Yeah. There certainly were things, but I think, like a lot of people, when I went to Duke, when I went to college, I was much less. I prayed. I was very. I felt God's presence.
Yeah.
But I wasn't involved in spiritual or religious things.
Organized
very
religion.
Much.
Yeah.
I was in the chapel choir for about a year, and I really loved that. But I also, there's just a lot going on.
Yeah, of course. And we're in a different time, and then you're breaking free. That's such a natural time to sort of distance. But what I heard in that was it almost sounded as if you had already started to divorce, for lack of a better term, God and your relationship with God and organized religion. Would that be true that by the time you went to college?
I think that would, yes. I think that would be true.
I wonder, it's probably...
Because I would go in, Duke has these beautiful gardens.
Yeah.
And it was I lived on a different campus, so than where my classes were, so you had to travel. And I would get on, they have buses, I would get on the bus, and I would always get off at the Duke, not every day, but really a lot, go to the Duke Gardens and walk through the Duke Gardens up to the campus. One of the things, my dad's dad and mother were both farmers. My grandmother, his mother, had one of the most beautiful gardens I have ever seen in my life along the road that went by their farm. And it was beautiful every summer. And my mom loved flowers. She always had flowers in the house, even in the bathroom. She would have a vase of flowers. And now I can't remember what I was starting to tell you.
You were sort of separating and divorcing dad and organized religion from your relationship with higher power.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And it was very much found. That's where I felt God's presence the most, and still do. And I think that's also connected to my photography. That when there are many times when I go out alone with my camera where I ask God to show me what God sees.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
First I asked God, show me what you want me to see. And then I thought, why not be really bold? And so I say, God, show me what you see.
Yeah, that's great.
It's like I want to be in on it.
Yeah.
And so that time before being up in the busyness of the university alone in God's presence was really important for me there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my church, but it was a space in which I could count on in that quiet feeling close to God.
And what a beautiful thing that I often call, I say God has many languages that God uses to talk to individuals. And some people just sort of have a clear one their whole life, and some people have various. But what a cool thing to note that, right, that's no different really than the language God spoke to you as a young girl in that chapel with the organ and in that beauty, Yeah, that's cool. That's a nice thread. Go ahead.
As we're talking about this, something comes to mind. Yeah. So if you want me to wait.
No.
I think a really important milestone for me spiritually, Howard and I both, I mentioned earlier, were seekers. Mm-hmm. And we had, we would alternate, because he grew up in the Presbyterian church, we would try the Presbyterian and the Methodist churches. And we moved a lot, so we were always looking at new churches. And as I mentioned, sometimes I just couldn't feel, one or the other or both of us wouldn't feel at home, and then we'd go somewhere else. And sometimes we give up.
Yeah.
But when my kids were in middle school, we lived in Indianapolis, and we were in a church there. It happened to be Presbyterian. And we had, both of us and our kids felt at home there pretty much. Mm-hmm. And it was a time when this issue was extremely important to me and most of the women that I knew, both as friends, colleagues, but also as clients, in my social work. And that was what women should and shouldn't do.
Yeah.
It was that period of time. That's always still, that's still with us for sure. But, and there was a guest preacher, and he started talking about women should not work outside the home. Women should be helpmates at home and mothers at home. And he really went on a little too long for me. And we were sitting in the balcony. Probably we'd gotten there late, which you may have noticed is still our habit, that we often just barely get there on time if.
The back pews are always reserved for the Backus family, so I get you.
So I just turned to Howard and the kids and said, I'm going to leave now. If you want to come with me, you can come with me. And this had happened once before when we lived in Memphis. That was years ago. And then the ministers was talking about gay and lesbian people should not be able to adopt children. Uh-huh. And it was the same thing. I just left. Enough of this.
Yeah.
And but this time, I said, when we got home, I said, that's it. I said, Howard, that's it. I am not going back to church. Mm-hmm. I'm really serious. You do whatever you want to. I feel bad because the kids are involved, and that's good for them. Yeah. But I just, I don't like this being caught off guard by something that makes me so enraged. Yeah. Because everybody's hearing it, not just me, and it's crap. So anyway, the shorter version would be maybe 2 or 3 years later. Mm-hmm. By then, Howard was going to the Episcopal Church, and he was very involved in work with HIV/AIDS at the Damien Center in Indianapolis. And we went to an event with people who were involved in that program. And over in the corner, there were these people, men and women, standing over the corner just dying laughing. And I didn't really know.
This is in the church or in the...
In this event.
Okay.
In this event. It was like some kind of meet or greet. I don't know what it was. Raise money, probably. Yeah. And so I just couldn't help myself. I went over and interrupted and says, I have to know what is so funny. And one of them just started laughing, and he could hardly talk for laughing. He said, we're talking about our spiritual directors. I had never heard that term in my life.
Yeah.
You know, in the Methodist Church at that time, that wasn't, you know, something. And I said, what in the world is a spiritual director? And so they took their turns telling me what it was to them. Mm-hmm. And I said, can you meet with a spiritual director if you're not going to church? Mm-hmm. And one of them said, well, really, that's probably the best time to meet with a spiritual director. And I said, well, give me some names. So they did. They gave me some names. And the person that I picked off that list, because they'd put, you know, a little information about him, her name was Karen. She was a Roman Catholic nun. Mm. And somehow in my mind, the fact that she was different in her denomination, as it were, in her practices, made her appeal to me more than the others. And anyway, so that's who I went to see. And she, I mean, I still think about her. She is still, what she did and the time with her is the gift that still gives. Yeah. She, when I met with her, she listened. And she listened. And at the end of our first meeting, she said, I want you to give you some homework. And it may take you a while. It may be what we talk about for several times when we meet, but I want you to go back and map out your life in 5-year periods. And I want you, as best you can remember, just write some notes about what did you believe or understand about God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus during that period of time, and who did you learn it from? And then she said, when you've finished with this, I want you to spend some time going back and looking at it and praying about it and thinking about what's different now. What do you believe about God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit now?
Right.
At your age, at this point in time. It was, you know, I think especially having grown up in the church, and often I didn't have any trouble with who had taught me. I mean, there were Sunday school teachers as well as my dad and my mom. But it was just such a provocative and at the same time really totally open thing to think about. And it really did help me, as you were describing it, kind of separate my childhood relationships.
Yeah, I can see that.
And over time and over those years before then when I was struggling so much with it, really. Yeah. And then we kept meeting and kept, you know, it really, and it was probably a couple of years in, maybe even longer than that she said to me, you know, Peg, Jesus didn't have in mind for people to follow him in solitude. And I know that works really well for you. But she says, and I know you're not going to like this, but I think it's really time for you to find a group of believers to
journey with.
To journey with.
Yeah,
to journey with. And she said, I'll still be here. You can say anything you want to say to me about them or whatever. Yeah. But I think that's the way it works best. Yeah. And you need to do that.
Man, and that's something that it's so, I mean, not to insert my story in here, but like, it took me a long time to learn that because I took it for granted and I didn't have the same experiences. But we were in church a lot, and I was very in tune with my spiritual life, but didn't necessarily, I didn't necessarily look at my church life as my spiritual life. I mean, it was there, but mine was very internal and was separate. And so I never, it's so ironic that I'm a priest, because I was like, you don't need any of this stuff. Organized religion, you didn't need all this people. I used to say it's just a social club, all these things. And I want to say not until really years into priesthood did I start to go, oh, okay, this is, we don't say family. Like, I know that seems cliche, but it really is people taking care of each other. It's people journeying together. And that's beautiful, Anyway, but what a great, I love that. That's so great. I mean, that really put a bow on, what a great anecdote from your life of a process to separate those things. And what a gift that spiritual director that she
was.
Yeah,
she was.
Yeah.
And there has really not been a time since then when I have not had and been involved with a spiritual director.
Yeah.
It's like I felt like, I don't know, it was like a lifeline to help me stay focused on what it was for me.
Yeah.
To not get caught up in the expectations,
Right.
And it was really a spiritual director in New York City when Howard started talking about, he started in Indianapolis, but we moved really quickly, and he really got seriously talking about being, becoming a parish priest. And so he's talking about that with great, enthusiasm. And I would just keep saying, that's not funny, Howard.
Yeah.
It is not funny to me. And then as it became really clear, that he was serious, then it was one of those times when it was between me and God.
Yeah.
I was very angry with God. I said, this is not funny.
Not what I signed up for, man.
It feels like a joke. If I had wanted to marry a minister, I knew plenty of them. I could have done that.
I mean, it's not funny, but it is funny, I mean, it's just such a, it's, I don't know if I want to go that far, but it's just that great reversal stuff God does in our life. It's like the opposite. Yeah.
And she was so helpful. She said, well, that's God's call to Howard. Our work is, what is God calling you to? Right. And actually, my work with her came at a time when my call really shifted. And when we left New York City, I left without knowing what my call was. Yeah. I couldn't find it. I mean, I kept being in these, she would say, that's the way it works. I would be in these fields. I'd be like hiking and come into a field and there'd be all this emptiness, and I would just start crying and say, God, why won't you let me know what it is you're calling me to do next? And she just said, sometimes God needs for you to really be empty and ready before God tells you. And then God did.
Yeah. Fields and emptiness. Are you meaning
space? Like you're outside and you're walking
natural.
through
I didn't
a
know
forest.
if you meant like fields of work. Like you
just come into a space that's huge, and there's
I get you.
Grass or something.
I didn't know if you meant like going into a professional field and it felt empty. Right. That makes sense. And there again is another. It's God's language with you, right?
Yeah.
You're going out into nature and experiencing the beauty or the emptiness and being called into a intimate and vulnerable space with God, right?
Yeah. And after we moved to Aiken, South Carolina, that's where Howard's first call was to be the assistant rector there after he finished seminary. So those who are listening will understand that he did become a priest. And when he was in his parish internship, and I would go with him to that little church, where nearly everybody there was Hispanic, and the preacher was a Cuban woman.
That was in Aiken?
That was in outside of, where is it? In Connecticut. Where
went
Yale
with the seminary.
Is.
Yeah.
That I could see that this was what he was meant to do. It was just so clear.
Yeah.
And I also could see that I needed to drive my own car to church. So I could leave before he had to, before he did. Because that was something that always bugged me, is we had to wait until my dad was finished to leave. And he was never finished.
Nope.
And then I saw, here are the same thing is happening with Howard. So anyway, so in Aiken was a place, we were only there 3 years, but it was a very powerful place in terms of my understanding of my call and what God and the Spirit, I would say I feel it's very clear to me that the Spirit talks to me and nudges me, and sometimes I have to argue with the Spirit and say, no, I shouldn't say that to somebody. That's really not appropriate. And so I say to them, the Spirit is saying I should say this. It's not really appropriate, so I hope you don't mind. But I had a friend who decided to go into training for spiritual direction. And she asked me if I would like to do that with her. And I was really surprised. But then when I talked with her and with Howard and thought about the kind of conversations I had with people and the kind of things that people would bring up with me, I realized that made some sense.
Yeah.
And I was very curious. And I thought about Karen, and I thought about my own spiritual director since then.
Yeah.
And that was something important. I needed to try it out. I didn't have this sense of, oh yes, that's a great fit. It was more like, I need to know more about that.
See what's up, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I would say that was very formative for me. It was a program designed, the woman who directed that program, it was sponsored by the Diocese of South Carolina, one of the two of them, the lower one.
Yeah.
And she was a graduate of Shalem, and she had worked with Shalem on designing that program. Okay. And it had a residency every spring, and all these, not all these, but a group of faculty who came back every year, and then people who were faculty who were, year-to-year gigs.
Yeah.
But the time was designed so that we had a lot of silence.
Yeah.
And that was really the first place I was in silence in community. I mean, a long silence.
Yeah.
At meals.
Yeah.
The only place we were not in silence was in our worship services. And I was really there. I played the piano. After I graduated got my certificate, they invited me to be on the staff there. So it was like every spring I would go to residencies of different groups, and I would keep learning, and it was really good. Mm-hmm. I had a wonderful peer group. You had to have a peer group, it was where you talked about what was happening with you, with the people you were meeting with. It wasn't like case conferences or whatever. And then the second thing was that Howard and some other folks from the church went to a big meeting to learn about Stephen ministry. And when I read the training book for Stephen ministers, I realized this is one of the most amazing pieces of curriculum I've ever seen. Oh, cool. It's a combination of good social work teaching.
Right.
And spiritual teaching.
Right.
And so I had to do that. I mean, it said, sign me up, whatever you need me to do. I just really want to do this.
But that's interesting because, I always struggle to describe to people what spiritual direction is. But in some ways, using what you just said about Stephen ministry, it's sort of counseling /therapy and spiritual teaching, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It's. I just wish more people, more parishes and more people, really understood that, because it's so. The people who are offering Stephen Ministry grow, and it feeds their spiritual lives, as well as the people who receive it.
Yeah.
And it's a way, like you said, for the people in a parish to care for each other.
Right.
It's what it is.
Right.
Only it's kind of formalized a little bit. But another thing happened there, and I don't talk about this very much, but I sang in the choir there. And the choir in the church in Aiken is up behind where the preacher preaches from, he or she, where that whatever you call it.
Like the chancel, yeah.
And then the altar's there, and then you go around back behind the altar. There's a wall, and you go back around, and there are windows there and stuff. So we stood up to go to the Eucharist, the choir did. And I stood up, and I heard this voice as clear as if you said it, sitting here to me. Feed my sheep. And I looked around. Nobody else was showing any indication that they heard this. It was startling. It was really startling. But it fit with everything I was being called to right then. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Spiritual direction, Stephen Ministry, feed my sheep.
Right. Feed the a different kind of sustenance, right? And what's great about that too is like you weren't like in prayer or in nothing. You just get this.
I just stood up to go to Eucharist.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a gift.
Yeah.
I encounter that in these stories, in these episodes, every so often. And it's more than you would think. But people, just like you said, a lot of people are unwilling to sort of name it or share it. It's definitely a language, I would say, that God uses with some folks. Yeah.
And part of what was wonderful was that at the same time I was then in that training, and the training had taught us, we'd learned a lot of different, I don't know what to call them, exercises maybe, different ways to help people study scripture.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways was to pick scripture, some verses, and pick a person and role play that person in your mind, obviously in your mind, and see how it feels, and what they said, and and then role play be somebody else. And try to get the full feeling of that, the meaning of the words and the messages and that. Be in it.
I mean, that reminds me of like Ignatian practices where, you rewrite the scripture, and it might be from the perspective of somebody that's not even really talked about, or it's what's interesting to me about that is that's almost what your spiritual director did with you, the first one, when she asked you those questions, because it was bringing you into the relationship with God, as opposed to like, what did my dad say that relationship is? What does the church say what that is? She asked questions so that you asked yourself, what do I?
I hadn't thought
Putting
about
you in
that.
it.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And it was really powerful. I remember doing that at the place, outside at the place where we had, I think I even saved it to do it there when the next residency was, which was probably pretty soon after that. But and I when I started with the photography, which was about, I've been a photographer always. I had a camera as a kid. But when I really got serious about having photos that I might sell or share with other people, I really had to think about the feed my sheep and how that fit with that. And one of the things that's been really remarkable to me is that not always, but in some of the stories that people share with me about living with a photo of mine is the way that photo feeds them.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful.
And it really motivates me very strongly. I mean, to know that can happen. I can't make it happen. They select the photo, so that's part of it. They pick something that they want to live with or be with. I have a friend who bought this photo of buffalo in this field, and I love the picture because the grass in the field was so high that some of the buffalo were below the grass, you know. And he's really the only person actually who's ever shown any interest in that picture. And he bought it, and later called me out of nowhere and said, "I just want to tell you that I've been sitting with the buffalo." It was almost like, what, you know. Then I remember, and he said, almost every day at some point, I look at those buffalo and I just sit down, and it takes me thousands of miles away, and I'm just somewhere else for a while. And so he said, "Thank you for that photo." I'm like, you know, of all things, a photo of buffalo and grass, you know.
Yeah.
But he picked it. It had meaning to him, obviously.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
What a beauty. Yeah, I don't know that I've entertained. I like art, but it's not something that tends to speak to me strongly. Music definitely does. What isn't art, right? But that's interesting to me on both sides of what I hear you saying. One, just the feed my sheep, that you get this sense that by your, man, there's so many messages in that. I mean, by your being open and aware and conscious of God's presence and the beauty all around you, right? You can actually then share that with other people and thereby feed them, right? That's awesome. The other side that I hear that's really cool is I wish more people understood. That person, your friend, had a clear awareness of when something is speaking to him. And he almost allowed that to become a practice, you know? And I wonder, I don't know if, and maybe you would disagree with this, but I think a lot of people in life and a lot of people in the church don't have a clear awareness of, well, as I say all the time in these shows, a lot of people don't have a clear awareness of the language God uses with them, which is really, I mean, if you think about it, that's super powerful. Because if you know, like your friend or you, or right, if you know, oh, this is where God usually feeds me, this is how I'm fed through God, this is where God speaks to me, then when we're in those places in life where we're discerning or we're in a dark place or whatever it might be, that's a tool now. Does that make sense?
It does. That's a great sermon.
I wish.
You know, you need to watch for it because I bet something will pop up that'll let you use that.
Yeah.
And which reminds me, several weeks ago you talked about the huge importance of being in solitude with God in our relationship with God. And I thought as you were talking about that, about the first time I was really in silence for so long, being in that training situation. And that, especially because a lot of people in our parish are at least new to the parish, and I have no idea how many of them are seekers and how many of them have had different experience. You know, I don't know that much about most of them. But I can imagine, and then I saw you had it scheduled recently to be a service where people would come and be together in meditation. And I think that would be a good thing to do more of. Yeah. Because I think many of us are in quiet with God alone.
Yeah.
But there's a very different experience when we're in silence with God, with others who are also in silence with God.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I try where I can, like in a Sunday service, to really hold silence sometimes, because we're all there together, gathered, and I'll even wait till I can actually feel the room settle. Because you always have a couple of those folks, they're not catching the cues, or they're not feeling, and they're shuffling and they're doing whatever, and I'll wait until I can feel that sort of thickness in the air. It's also why, to your point, that's why Lectio Divina and these sorts of things I like to do with people, because it is you're in this prayer together, and you have really extended time of silence, and it feels different. You remind me with that example too of spiritual direction. I don't know if this is how you do direction, but when I meet with directees, like the front end, I always tell them, like, I'm going to say a prayer. I'm going to sort of set this time aside. We're going to offer this time to God. And then I'm going to sit in silence. And it's up to you when we break that silence. And to sit there, even just with one other person, is really powerful. Yeah.
I don't know quite even how to describe it, but for me it's a different kind of acknowledgement of our connection to God. It's in front of other people who are doing the same thing and with other people who are doing the same thing. It's just, I mean, I think about that with the, when we have I can't think of the word. You can, bleep that out. When
you haven't said anything that bad.
It's like before Easter, where you come in and sit. Often a number of people are sitting in the darkness.
Oh yeah, vigil.
Vigil, that's the word, the vigil.
All night vigil.
It's
usually after Monday, Thursday night, to Good Friday.
It's such a powerful thing to do, and I mean, I'm sure there are many, many people who've would have never considered that as a real opportunity for a different kind of experience with God and with others.
For sure. That was some of my favorite moments of like being a teenager and having lock-ins at church. Is we would go, I can't remember if it was like planned or just happened, but always we would end up finding ourselves in the middle of the night in the sanctuary, just sitting there in the darkness. Yeah. Oh, not to be jokey, but on the other end, it just popped in my mind. On the other end, I've had some really not fun, which is probably me because I'm a big baby, but like scary, like at night in churches that I don't like. Trying to go lock the doors down in the depths of a church, and you're the only one there, and they had to turn all the lights off, and like, I don't know. I'm a baby that way, I guess, but man, sitting in the silence. I had another thought, but it's escaped me. Well, so what else do you think of? I mean, that we've gone around and touched a lot of different areas and things. Are there any other significant sort of quote unquote spiritual moments in life, or even like sort of dark night of the soul kind of stuff? I mean, what that looks like. People often don't talk about those, but
well, I've had some.
Yeah.
Dark night of the soul.
Yeah. I like to ask, I mean, one question I always ask in all these episodes is, what is and you may have named it already, but what's your most clear or powerful, maybe it was when you heard audibly, I don't know, but what's the sort of biggest quote unquote spiritual experience of your life?
Well, that don't usually talk about this even less than feed my sheep. Howard and I had, they talk about the empty nest as a real big deal.
Yeah.
And much to our surprise, our nest was part empty. We had one in college and one still at home.
Yeah.
And we went through a period together that was, it was very dark.
Yeah.
It was very dark. And part of the darkness of it was our questioning our love for each other and not being able to get clear, either alone or together, how to get out of the place where we were. I mean, it was a really painful, hard place.
Yeah.
And so we had couples therapy, and we both had individual therapy. We had spiritual directors. We had a lot of help. We had really a lot of help, and we really we finally decided to separate, and really struggled with only coming back together when it was clear that to each of us separately that that's what we wanted, and it was because we really did love the other. And so it was a very it was terrifying for me.
Sure.
Because I really tried to work on, which I think we do with God too, whether I needed Howard, I needed a husband, I needed a father for my children, or I loved him, really unconditionally loved him. Because by then, I really knew him pretty well. And it was a huge relief that we both felt like after a couple of weeks. We got together and talked about it, and we really felt like there was that love. And so we knew it would be hard, but we would really work on it. And I would say God was at the center of that, and has been, I think, in a different way, at the center of our life together. And we decided, it was around the time of our 20th anniversary, we decided to renew our vows and have a few friends come, our children come. They each had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and so, it was... And some of those people knew, and some of those people didn't know what the backstory was. But I'd say that certainly has been a milestone for us.
I love that too. Thank you for your vulnerability and for sharing that. And what I love about that is it's God walking with us in both the blessing and the love and the growth that comes after the hard stuff, but it's also God walking with us in the desert and in the wandering and in the challenge, and that's really beautiful. Anything else at all that you can think to? That seems like a great spot, but if there's anything else you want to share?
You can take this and insert it back when I was talking about spiritual direction, maybe, because it kind of doesn't...
Oh, it's okay.
Like it's hanging on the edge.
I don't have any order to these things.
One of the things that when I was a young mother, we were we had a church home at that point. In fact, in that church, we had both gotten baptized again.
Yeah.
Because we really, it was another time when we were, I guess, wanting to assert our adultness in it, that this is what we wanted. It wasn't just what our parents wanted. Deciding. They would be baptized.
Yeah.
And I had some really good women friends who were Christians during that time. I would have loved to, for some reason, been a part of a group of women during that time. It was a very hard time for me. It wasn't exactly the dark night of the soul, but it was hard.
Yeah.
I found being a parent, having lived in a complicated life as a child, and with my particular parents, was just it was hard to know what was the right thing to do so much of the time.
Yeah, it is crazy, right? Because something we don't talk about a lot, but like in a way, we really do just do what was done to us. Like that's all you know.
Or the opposite.
Exactly.
Which doesn't work great.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's weird. It's like being a young parent, all that stuff is brought out into the forefront, and you don't expect that, Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. But when I was in the Searching Court of the training for spiritual directors, although they call it the formation, which is really accurate.
Yeah.
We read a book about group spiritual direction.
Yeah.
And I didn't.
Sacred Companions, maybe?
I don't, could be, right. Yeah. I don't remember. There are not very many of them, even now. Mm-hmm. And so a friend of mine and I were just talking a lot about these kind of things, and she had been through training with Shalom for group spiritual direction. Yeah. So we had started one group, which now is really my spiritual direction now, that group, and it has met for 14 years.
Wow, that's great.
With 8 other women, who 2 of whom have moved away but come by Zoom.
Yeah.
But what I kept saying, her name is Lois, what I kept saying was, what I needed that I never had was a group of mothers about my age who were believers, who could get together regularly and support each other in their motherhood, their wifeness, and their spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. And I really want us to start a group of young mothers. It's like 12 or 13 years later. Yeah. I still think of them, put in my calendar, the young mothers, even though they're now, not young. That has been for them, but also for me.
Yeah.
Lois moved out of it several years ago, and so one of the young mothers agreed to be my co-facilitator. Mm-hmm. We have a set process we follow that is Shalom's process for groups, and it's just enough structure that it keeps you focused. Mm-hmm. It helps with monopolizing or exclusion, and it keeps you focused on this is spiritual direction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We always pray for each other. I mean, it's just really wonderful.
Yeah, it's funny you mention it because I just recently have fallen into. I recently went through a spiritual direction program for training, and that's its own thing. I don't need to talk about that, but not connected to that, I then in other parts of my life was invited into a weekly group of young men. Well, we're not that young anymore, but of men that were all the same age and have started to engage in that work, and it's been a blessing to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think about, and I think both the photography work and the back problems I've had have slowed
Yeah.
me down a little bit. But I still think about starting another group.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like it's rarely available to
Hey,
people.
we'll take it
and
here.
So fruitful.
Yeah. Yep.
And I had a friend, she's now deceased, but she did group spiritual direction in months. You know, they would agree to meet for so many months.
Yeah.
And then they would examine that, and some might stop and some might continue, and the group might shift who's in it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was continuous in terms of her availability.
Yeah.
But people made their own decision about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought about that. I've thought about it that at Good Sam a lot. Because and we should talk about that.
Yeah.
Because I really think for people to even have 6 weeks of that experience is an eye-opener about how vulnerable you can be and how much you can give to others. I mean, because it's so interactive and mutual. It forces you to be.
Yeah.
Even if what you're sharing about is how you can't be.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
And that's what for me as well. I mean that that is part of what's so powerful and what I love about direction in general. And it's what I think in some ways is missing, well, from society and culture, but also, at least for me, I feel like that's sort of what the church is supposed to be doing. And I feel like that's in some ways what people are hungry for. Yes, it's relationship with God, but it's to have that vulnerability and that deep connection together. And we really, by and large, don't do that. And so it's such a, I think it could be such a powerful thing.
When I said earlier how much providing spiritual direction deepens my faith, renews my faith, I can just see in that experience, by being with people over time, I can see, and they talk about, but I could observe it even if they didn't, how God is changing them. And God's presence and what they're, I think part of what works in spiritual direction is what happens in therapy or anything where you talk out loud, where you have to hear yourself.
Yeah. You
learn things.
Yeah, right. The naming of it, the processing. Yeah.
That it's that part of it's wonderful for people. It's another way to see. I remember in a sermon at Ascension, you encouraged us. It was one of those things that stood out for me, so I decided to try it, that every morning when we got up, we should pray, show me where you are, God. Let me see you at work. Show me where you are. And I encourage the people that I meet with. I mean, that's so helpful to people when they do it, when they really learn to do that and see and understand it. It's very powerful.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you again for that. But it's funny. It brings it full circle back to that again. Clicks with your, I call it God language. Like you're seeing God, asking to see what God sees, right? And I think what's so powerful about a practice like that is, for whatever reason, we fall into the trap of seeing God just in church. But the whole point is that you see it in nature, you see it in people, you see it in yourself, you see like that we live in that perspective in our waking lives, in our normal everyday lives. That's the goal, the real goal, right? Is to see that.
Yeah, because as you say that, you were in the beginning, you were talking about spirituality, and you didn't say as distinct from church, but I think that even when you're in church, having spirituality that's active outside of the church is, and seeing seeing and hearing is really, to me, that's the spirituality.
Yeah.
It moves and carries you, wherever you are. It's there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if we can just awaken to it, right? Or the kingdom of heaven is right here if you'll only behold it, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, I got to be respectful of your time. We've talked a lot longer than you probably even know or think.
I can imagine.
Which is awesome because it's fun. It's fun. I want to, we've talked a lot about spiritual direction, and we also mentioned your photography. I would love for you, where can people, if they're interested in seeing your photography, where can they access that? Is there a website?
There is.
Yeah.
There is.
Do you know it?
Yes, I do. And because it's incredibly straightforward and easy to remember.
Cool.
It's Peg Hess photography.com.
There we go. So if anybody wants to check out some of Peg's wonderful photography that now you have a background story for and you have some understanding of her perspective and her art, Peg Hess photography.com.
And right now, this is a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But every year since I've been preparing my photography to sell, I've made calendars.
Yes, I've got one in my office.
I grew up
Thank you.
loving the Audubon and the different conservationist organizations, calendars of beauty, mostly landscapes, not always. Yeah. And I always wanted to have a photo in one of those calendars.
Oh, cool.
So I've kind of gone overboard. Now I make two calendars, and all the photos are photos that I've taken that have different meaning to me and different stories.
That's awesome.
But right now there still are some calendars for 2024 for sale on that website.
Cool. So peghessphotography.com. And then you also do offer spiritual direction.
Yes,
right?
I do.
And if people wanted to ask you about that, they just email you or does that come through recommendation or through?
They should actually. We would want to talk about it.
Okay.
So my phone, which I also use for people who are interested in my photography, is the basic 865 640-1535.
Okay, and I'll put that in show notes and stuff if people are interested in contacting you.
But I would love to talk with anybody who's just interested to think about whether or not they might want to do spiritual direction. And all the people that I've met with over these 25 years, what I was taught in my training, and I think it's so wise, is we meet, and then after about 2 or 3 meetings toward the end, we say, okay, do you want to meet some more?
Yeah,
is this what you imagined? Right. Is this really working for you? And actually, there's one woman every time at the end of our meeting, I always say, now, do you want to meet again or not? It's kind of a joke between us.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Awesome. Well, it's been a joy and a pleasure chatting with you, Peg. I appreciate you coming and being open to it. And, maybe we'll do it again sometime. But
for me, too.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to walk with you in life. So
yes.
Appreciate you. All right. We'll do it again. Take care.